So, episode 9 of season 3 of The Bad Batch is here, and this episode has quite a few details that we need to unpack, so let's get straight into it. We begin the episode on Pabu, where we see Wrecker and Crosshair helping the locals with their day-to-day businesses, and one of the villagers say,
You got it, Wrecker. Thanks for the help, Crosshair.
who is voiced by Nika Futterman, the same voice actor behind Asajj Ventress. Wrecker teases Crosshair about his growing connection to the place, and we find Omega playing with Batcher along the beach. The two end up by a cave, and something spooks Batcher, and it is revealed to be none other than Asajj Ventress. The rest of the team catch wind of this, and as we get a better look at Asajj Ventress, this is the first time we've seen her since season 5 of the Clone Wars in the episode featuring Ahsoka's trial. And we see Ventress sporting this side-parting hairstyle, which is akin to the latest chapter in her story, which featured her meeting Jedi Master Quinlan Vos. Now, based on the story titled Dark Disciple, Ventress was supposedly killed by Dooku during a final confrontation. She was subsequently buried on Dathomir by Quinlan Vos and Kenobi, and chronologically, the events of the Bad Batch are supposed to take place after. So her presence here might suggest a change to her canon storyline. Now, of course, there could be a possibility that she was not dead and somehow lived, but I tend to think that her presence here in the Bad Batch might retcon the events of the Dark Disciple, or at the very least, its ending. There is also a good chance that Asajj's story might be featured in Tales of the Jedi, which might feature some change or retelling of her adventures with Quinlan Vos, in the same way Ahsoka's story in the show slightly deviated from the book. We learned that Fennec sent Asajj, and she explains what M-count means. She also mentions,
Those with a high count were believed to be more capable of wielding the Force.
which is quite interesting, especially in the way it was phrased. Now, as we learned all the way back in the Phantom Menace, it was previously assumed that the higher your midichlorian count, the greater connection to the Force an individual would have. However, what Asajj is suggesting here is that a high midichlorian count might suggest a stronger connection, but does not necessarily guarantee it. And it's a very subtle way of adding a little bit more subtext to the whole conversation about how scientific or mystical can an individual's connection to the Force be. Now, a scientific perspective might only rely on M-count being an indicator, but Asajj is also reaffirming that the spiritual mystical element of the Force is something still unaccounted for by just midichlorian numbers. Omega gets excited by the prospect of being Force sensitive, which represents the inner kid in all of us. Asajj warns the team that the Empire is on the hunt for high M-count individuals, and given that the title of this episode is the Harbinger, it might suggest that Asajj's warnings and revelations about Omega's M-count could bring on bigger, badder enemies for the Bad Batch, ranging from inquisitors all the way to the top dog himself. Omega asks Asajj to test her for her midichlorian levels, and she reluctantly agrees. Asajj gets Omega to do a balancing exercise while placing a fruit on top of her head, which is quite reminiscent of the balancing exercise Yoda had Luke do back in Dagobah. Omega asks if Asajj is a Jedi, and while she says she is not, an interesting thing to note is that Asajj's hair reveals a lot about her character regarding her place in the Force. Not only does growing her hair out signal a change in chapter, it also demonstrates her rejection of the Sith philosophy and a potential reversion to her earlier Jedi beginnings. Asajj was initially bald as a means to affirm her commitment to the Sith, but her current hairstyle actually harkens back to her old Padawan days. Crosshair checks text databases, and the team realizes that this is indeed Asajj Ventress, and immediately you can sense a lot of bad blood between the clones and the former assassin. Omega slips and Asajj tells her to collect a white flower from the Weeping Maya tree at the top of the mountain before the sun sets. And while this might appear to be a test, it's more likely that Asajj was just using this as an excuse to get Omega away from the ensuing confrontation with the clones. Omega initially tries to run up the mountain herself, but ends up using Batcher, which might be a slight clue as to Omega's Force sensitivity. Hunter tells Asajj to leave, but she insists on staying while also dangerously teasing the three.
Or maybe I'll stick around here a bit longer.
And this is very akin to the old Ventress that we know, and really reminded me of her old banter with Kenobi.
Ventress. And here I thought this mission would be unpleasant.
The pleasure's all mine, my dear Obi-Wan. I've missed you.
They all end up fighting each other, and I have to say the hand-to-hand combat animation is some of the best I've seen come out of Star Wars in a while. Not only are the movements so clearly depicted at speed, but the way each and every one of them fight is very akin to their character. Asajj, clearly being faster than all of them, fights in a way you would expect an assassin to, precise and quick movements, while someone like Wrecker fights slower, Hunter fights like a regular, well-trained guy, and Crosshair is really the only one who can somewhat match Asajj's speed. Another interesting to note is that once Asajj realizes that her strikes are having very little effect on Wrecker's massive size, she takes the sneaky approach and temporarily blinds him to keep him out of the fight. Really just cleverness on her part. There is also a moment where I believe Asajj and Hunter fight based on Wing Chun, which is usually quite iconic for its hand-to-hand engagement. But I'm no martial arts expert, so if you can better break it down, let me know in the comments down below. It becomes pretty evident that the three are outclassed, which is not a surprise. The clones manage to get their blasters, and Asajj reveals her yellow lightsaber, and as she says,
"You're making it very tempting."
You get the sense that there is a part of that darker side of Ventress that is still lurking there. For those who last saw Ventress in the Clone Wars, you might be surprised as to where she got the yellow lightsaber, especially since in that last episode it was revealed that Barriss Offee had stolen Asajj's red lightsabers. Well, since that incident, Ventress managed to acquire a yellow lightsaber off the black market, and the color yellow is intended to symbolize her severance of connection with Dooku and the Sith, but not quite a full return to the Jedi ways. Omega returns with the White Blossom, and we see Asajj holding everyone down. Hunter calls Ventress a war criminal, and it's not surprising as to why, considering the things that she has done to the clones as well. Ventress goes on to talk about changing times and how they were all pawns in the war, which is not only a reference to the way Palpatine used the Republic and Separatists to eliminate the Jedi and secure his power, but also harkens back to an earlier character arc of hers where she realized she was betrayed by Dooku following orders from Sidious to get rid of her out of concern that she was growing too powerful. Omega tries to convince Hunter and the rest to trust Asajj, trying to convince them that people change, something which she helped Crosshair to do. And for the most part, while Omega's sentiment is unapologetically optimistic, it's not surprising that the clones are skeptical, especially if you've watched the things Asajj did during the Clone Wars. The team ultimately decide to trust Omega's judgment, and she meets Asajj by the docks where she takes note of Batu's presence. And this subtle scene essentially hints at the possibility that Omega might be force sensitive due to her ability to connect with animals, something which Asajj tries to test as they head out into the waters. As Omega holds out her hand towards the water and subsequently gives up, Asajj gives a quick demonstration on how it is done. The scene is also somewhat reminiscent of Luke's own experience on Dagobah with Yoda. Asajj's use of the Force ends up triggering a monster, and during the ensuing chaos we get some pretty neat animation details such as Asajj's hair after it has come into contact with water. Asajj is finally able to stop the monster using the Force to connect with it, which in many ways cements the idea of her changed character. Where she would once have likely resorted to violence in order to defeat the creature, she chooses to use a much more peaceful solution. Before Asajj parts ways with the Bad Batch, she tells Omega that she doesn't have the Force, but it turns out that the answer is not quite as straightforward. Crosshair picks out that she is lying, and it seems like Ventress herself is rather inconclusive as to whether Omega can use the Force, so the question is still up in the air. But the important thing to note is that the episode seems to suggest that having a high M count does not always equate to using the Force, and so it could be the case that Omega has a high M count but still won't be able to use the Force. Asajj warns them about the Empire and how Pabu is not quite as safe as they think it is, potentially foreshadowing the Empire's arrival in the next episode. There's also a cheeky moment at the end where she says,
"I've got a few lives left,"
hinting at her change of fate following her supposed death in the book. Anyways, that's all for this breakdown. Let me know what you think in the comments down below. As always, be sure to like and subscribe, and I will see you in the next one. I am the Lost Acolyte,
and I have spoken.